The emergency klaxon wailed through Galactic Station 8492, its shrill, repetitive sound setting every nerve on edge. Code Violet, the station's AI repeated through the corridors. Hull breach, reactor failure, hostile boarding, or something monumental. Security Chief Crick Tall, a massive being whose species had evolved for crisis management, bolted through the labyrinthine hallways, sweat beading on his furrowed brow. His mind raced, running through countless scenarios, but none of them prepared him for what he would find. Rounding a corner, Crick and his team of armed warriors, 8 heavily armored Colli, skidded to a halt outside Unit 847B. Weapons drawn, they entered with the calculated precision of a species bred for conflict. But the sight inside was anything but a battle. Mark, a human maintenance worker, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sipping tea in a pair of cartoon-covered pajamas. In his lap, a tiny creature, an apex predator from the distant Vexlor system, was curled up asleep, wearing a homemade sweater. The cub, whose species was notorious for its deadly venom and brutal hunting prowess, looked harmless now, defenseless even, purring softly in Mark's embrace. "You brought a killing machine onto my station," Crick's translator sputtered, struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Mark, unbothered, simply looked up and shrugged. "Her name's Buttons." The silence that followed was deafening. 16 hours earlier, Mark had been finishing routine diagnostics in Cargo Bay 12 when an odd sound caught his attention. A faint whimper, followed by a low growl, echoed from behind a stack of grain containers. Moving cautiously, Mark knelt and peeked behind the crates. What he found was a sight that shook him to his core. A small, trembling Vexlor cub, no bigger than a house cat, her fur matted and eyes clouded from dehydration, bloodied claws from desperate attempts to escape the cargo netting wrapped around her frail body. The cub, abandoned and on the verge of death, mewled pitifully. Mark's heart clenched. "Station AI," he called, voice tight. "I found an abandoned Vexlor cub in Cargo Bay 12. The AI's response was cold, almost indifferent. "Confirmed. Vexlor cub, approximately 3 weeks old, displaying signs of malnutrition and exposure. Cause of abandonment, likely maternal rejection due to weak birth status." "Should I leave her here?" Mark asked, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "Correct. That is preferred protocol, according to Vexlor cultural law and Galactic Wildlife Conservation Statute 4.7.2. Mark's stomach twisted in disgust. He looked at the pitiful creature in front of him, shivering as she tried to crawl toward him. "That's not happening," he muttered, scooping her up gently. With no thought for the consequences, he cradled her against his chest. By morning, Mark had filled out adoption paperwork in crayon, thanks to a tipsy night clerk, and he had a cub. The galaxy would soon learn the price of that decision. Mark's act of compassion had no precedent. Vexlor law was clear. Weak cubs were abandoned to die. It was their way of ensuring the survival of the strongest, nature's law as they saw it. But Mark didn't care for laws written by cold, calculating minds. He had a cub to protect. It was just after sunrise when the Vexlor High Council caught wind of the adoption. Ambassador Tara, a towering matriarch whose mere presence filled a room with oppressive authority, arrived at Station 8492 with her retinue of 22 elite warriors. Their ship tore through space at a blistering speed, and within hours they arrived, ready to reclaim what they saw as their property. Buttons. Mark sat in his quarters, Buttons curled up in his lap, watching Earth-nature documentaries as though nothing had changed. But change was inevitable. The door opened, and Tara's presence flooded the room. Her 12 eyes narrowed as she took in the sight. The human, Mark, calm, unbothered by the armed Vexlors, and the cub, now growing stronger under his care. "You have stolen a Vexlor child." Tara's voice was a low growl, filled with cold authority. Mark didn't flinch. "I saved her," he replied simply, looking down at Buttons, who was now awake, staring up at Tara with wide eyes. Tara's gaze shifted from Mark to the cub, then back. "You defy Vexlor tradition. That is unforgivable." Mark stood up slowly, holding Buttons protectively. "I don't care about your tradition. She's mine now." As the days passed, Buttons flourished under Mark's care. The once frail cub grew stronger, her fur softening, her 6 eyes now glimmering with intelligence. Mark had built her a sprawling climbing structure in the station's park, constructed from scrap metal and decommissioned cargo containers. Buttons spent hours scaling it, her movements fluid and graceful, a reflection of her species' lethal agility. She was no longer just an abandoned cub. She was becoming a formidable creature, feared and admired by the station's residents. But her growing presence stirred unease. To most, Buttons was a living reminder of human compassion, of Mark's defiance of the Vexlor matriarchy. But to the aliens aboard Station 8 1292, she was a symbol of danger, a predator that had no business being coddled. Whispers of rebellion began to spread through the corridors. Mark, now a fixture on the station, was treated with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. One afternoon, Button's predatory instincts flared when a group of young Colathi, a race known for their love of intellectual pursuits but devoid of combat experience, attempted to approach her. Buttons hissed at them, her 6 eyes flashing in unison. The Colathi froze in fear, uncertain whether to flee or face the beast. Mark intervened quickly, his calm voice cutting through the tension, but the damage was done. Fear spread, not just of Buttons, but of the human who had raised her. Tensions reached a boiling point when the station's diplomatic corps, already agitated by the presence of a Vexlor cub, began petitioning for her removal. A decision was inevitable, and Mark knew he would have to fight for her. It wasn't until Callum and Petra, 2 humans from Earth, arrived at Station 8 492 with their 2 young children, Sloane and Beckett, that the tension Mark had been avoiding truly surfaced. The children, unfamiliar with the vast expanse of space and alien cultures, were drawn to Buttons immediately. They saw her climbing her makeshift structure in the park, her eyes scanning her surroundings with an intelligence that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Sloane, the older of the 2, cocked her head in curiosity, whispering to her younger brother. "Is that a dog?" Beckett asked, running toward the creature without hesitation. Mark, sitting nearby on a bench reading maintenance reports, heard the question and felt his stomach drop. The moment he looked up, he knew this would be a challenge. Buttons, who had been steadily growing in size and confidence, now faced her first human encounter outside of the safety of her adopted family. As Beckett approached, Buttons hesitated, her instincts momentarily on edge. "She She's, uh, complicated, Mark said, scrambling to his feet, trying to head off the situation before it escalated. But Sloane, with the blunt curiosity of a 6-year-old, pressed further. She doesn't look like you. Is she really your cub? The question stung. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sloane cut in. My teacher says real families look the same. She doesn't look like you at all. She's got all that fur, and those extra eyes, and that tail. Mark's heart clenched. Buttons, clearly hurt, began to back away, her body language turning defensive. Without another word, she darted off into the station's corridors, her 6 eyes wide and brimming with confusion. Mark, desperate to fix things, sprinted after her. The fear in her small form was palpable. She had just realized what it felt like to truly not belong. Mark found Buttons 20 minutes later, wedged deep into one of the station's maintenance ducts. Her fur was matted, and her 6 eyes glistened with the raw emotion of a child who had been rejected. Her body trembled, her claws scraping against the metal walls as she curled into a tight ball, trying to make herself as small as possible. Mark's heart broke at the sight. This was not the fierce predator she was meant to become. This was a scared, confused cub, lost in a world that didn't understand her. Buttons, Mark called softly, kneeling down next to the air vent. You don't have to hide from me. I'm not going anywhere. There was a long pause before a small voice echoed from the duct, muffled but clear. If you had a real cub, would you still want me? The question hit Mark like a blow to the chest. He had always known that Buttons was different. She wasn't human. She wasn't like him. But that didn't matter. Not to him. Still, hearing her ask that, hearing her doubt herself, shattered him. No, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. No, I wouldn't. I would never want anyone else but you. There was a pause, and then Buttons, cautiously at first, poked her head out from the duct, her 6 eyes locked with his, full of hope and pain. Mark reached out, gently lifting her into his arms. You're my real cub. You always have been. For the first time in a long while, Buttons relaxed in his arms, feeling safe. Mark had given her something she never had before, belonging, and as they sat there in the quiet of the maintenance corridor, he knew their bond had only just begun to deepen. The silence that followed Mark's declaration echoed in the hallways of Station 8, 492, like a cosmic stillness before a storm. Just hours after Mark had comforted Buttons, the Vexlor High Council arrived, led by Ambassador Tara herself. The matriarch's presence filled the room like an oppressive weight, her towering figure casting a long shadow. Her 14 eyes glowed with cold authority, and her mandibles clicked as she regarded Mark and Buttons with a mixture of fury and disbelief. You have stolen a Vexlor child. Tara's voice was low, resonating with the power of a centuries-old tradition. Mark, holding Buttons protectively in his arms, didn't flinch. He had known this moment was coming. I saved her, he replied simply, his voice unwavering. Tara's eyes narrowed, and the other members of the High Council, a council made up of the most powerful Vexlors in the galaxy, observed with growing disdain. You have broken Vexlor law, human, Tara continued. Abandoned cubs are not to be saved. They are not worthy of protection. You've adopted a weakling. Mark's jaw tightened. She's not weak, he said, his gaze fierce. She was abandoned, yes, but that's not who she is now. You defy Vexlor tradition, one of the council members sneered. The matriarchy has no place for weakness. And yet, Mark shot back, his voice cutting through the tension. It's your tradition that's wrong. You left her to die. I'm not going to let her die. Not on my watch. The room grew tense as the council members exchanged glances. For the first time in centuries, Vexlor tradition was being challenged. Tara's mandibles clicked again, her expression unreadable. She stood motionless, calculating her next move. Would she have the strength to change, or would she uphold the cruelty of her people? Mark's challenge had begun, but the outcome was far from certain. The Vexlor High Council had never been questioned, not in the 40,000 years of their existence. And yet, in the sterile, tension-filled atmosphere of Station 8, 492, a cub, a creature no older than a toddler, was about to challenge that age-old tradition. Buttons, now growing rapidly under Mark's care, stood beside him. She wasn't the fragile, abandoned cub she had been. Her fur had thickened, her eyes sharp and alert, and her body now reflected the power of her species. But she wasn't here for strength. She was here for something greater, something Mark had given her, the ability to question her own place in the universe. Tara's gaze was still fixed on Mark, her translator struggling to process the words of defiance that Mark had thrown her way. But as Buttons stepped forward, her voice, a combination of hiss and purr, pierced the silence. "You're not my mother," she said, her words resounding through the council chamber. The room fell silent, and the High Council recoiled. No Vexlor cub had ever spoken against the matriarchy, and certainly not one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Buttons wasn't just defying her birth mother. She was declaring the matriarchy's rules wrong. "You abandoned me," Buttons continued, her voice stronger now. "You left me to die, and then you say, that's how it's supposed to be. Mark saved me. He took me in when no one else would. He's my father, not you." The council members, whose eyes had once glowed with cold certainty, now flickered with uncertainty. They had never heard a cub speak with such conviction, such defiance. Tara's mandibles clicked sharply, but the contempt that had once been there now wavered. For the first time in the history of the Vexlors, a cub had chosen to reject their laws, and it was the strongest thing they had ever seen. The matriarchy, so secure in its traditions, was now facing a fracture it had never anticipated. The silence in the chamber stretched like a living thing, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Mark held Buttons close, every muscle in his body taut, ready to protect her no matter what the council decided. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the ancient traditions of the Vexlor species to either break or remain unchallenged. Tara stood unmoving, her mandibles clicking, her eyes flickering with a storm of conflicting emotions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tara spoke. Her voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of something new, a reluctant recognition. "The High Council has deliberated," she said, her tone echoing through the chamber. The other council members shifted, murmuring to each other in a low hum, their disagreement palpable. Mark braced himself, sensing the gravity of the moment. "And?" he asked, his voice firm, but filled with anticipation. Tara's eyes locked with his, her gaze sharp and calculating. "The matriarchy has decided that we will not take the cub," she declared. The words struck the air with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Mark exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders for the first time since the confrontation had begun. But then, Tara added, "However, there are conditions." Mark's heart sank. He had known the Vexlor would never allow this without a cost. "You must allow Buttons to be educated in Vexlor history and culture," Tara continued. "She will undergo training in combat techniques, and she must be registered in our records as part of the matriarchy's adoptive clan status." Mark stared at her, trying to process the decision. "You're letting her stay?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Against our traditions, yes, but the human has demonstrated something we had not anticipated," Tara replied, her mandibles clicking again. "Strength. Perhaps a kind of strength we have forgotten." Mark looked down at Buttons, who was staring up at him, her 6 eyes wide with hope. The room was silent as the weight of the decision hung in the air. The matriarchy had been forced to bend, but the future was far from clear. Mark stood in the quiet of the corridor, holding Buttons tightly against his chest. The decision of the Vexlor High Council had shattered centuries of tradition, but it had also paved the way for something entirely new. Buttons, the first Vexlor cub raised by another species, now had a future, one that was hers to shape, with Mark by her side. The station, once a symbol of cold bureaucracy, had become a beacon of possibility, a symbol of what could happen when compassion overpowered law, when love defied tradition. The cheers outside were deafening. Station 8, 492, with its mix of species from across the galaxy, was celebrating not just the defiance of Vexlor law, but the birth of a new way of thinking. Parents from every corner of the station gathered their children closer, their eyes filled with a new understanding. Even the Colathi warriors, who had once feared Buttons, now stood silently, their weapons lowered, as if recognizing the humanity of this unlikely family. As Mark walked back to his quarters, with Buttons nestled in his arms, he felt the weight of his decision settle over him. But it wasn't a burden. It was the weight of responsibility, of love, of a new future that had been forged in defiance of everything that had come before. "You're my daughter, Buttons," Mark said softly, his voice cracking with emotion. "And no matter how big you get, I'll always be here. Always." Buttons, now fully grown and towering beside him, nuzzled his cheek, her voice soft but filled with the power of her newfound family. "I know, Dad. Always." And for the first time in her life, Buttons understood that family wasn't defined by blood. It was defined by those who chose to love, protect, and never let go. The Vexlor had learned that lesson, and perhaps so had the galaxy. As the station continued to cheer, Mark and Buttons walked forward, hand in paw, into a future where love, no matter the species, could rewrite the stars.